Welcome back, everybody, to DeepRob for Lecture 13. And today's lecture is going to be a continuation of the last lecture. So in this one, instead of just setting up object detection, we're going to now start looking at a few more examples of actual object detectors. And we'll briefly, at the end, assuming we have time, we'll just briefly kind of skim the surface of instance segmentation. And so we'll see how far we get. So with that, I don't have any slides for administrative updates. The only, one to be aware of is that starting next week, we'll have the seminar style lectures start. So I was pleased. I've gotten, I think, a couple of reviews turned in. Today, I'll send in just like a reminder email to everyone who's going to present next week about when they're presenting. I'll just ask that if you're presenting on Monday, you get me your slides before Sunday, so meaning like by Saturday night. So that I have time on Sunday to actually format them and put them together. The other thing I'm going to do tonight is I know I put like a Keynote and a PowerPoint template that just has our theme, like the DeepRob theme, so that everyone's slides are consistent. Because what I'll do is I'll format everyone's slides into a shared document so that we don't have to transition people plugging in and out their computers, so that it'll all be formatted on one document, which I'll have on my computer, and so everyone can share my computer for going through their slides. But the one other thing I'm going to do tonight is, in addition to that template, what I'm going to do is put actually like more of a true template. So I'll actually put together empty slides that would cover the core sections we'd expect for every paper to generally have. So basically like background section, so like maybe one slide on an introduction to the problem, another slide on who the authors are, another slide then on related work, right? So like sketching out like a rough skeleton of an actual PowerPoint. You can then choose to fill in those specific sections or remove some or add some. You'll have some discretion based on what the contents of your individual paper is, but I think having that skeleton will help give like a little bit more context on what should go into these presentations, and also help standardize them a little bit so that we don't have too much of like a huge context switch for the audience going from like one style of presenting to like a totally different style. Having said that, we do like originality in presentations, so don't feel like you're constrained to the skeleton. Let me think. So there's that update. We're not going to record these presentations, so if you're interested in the material, which everyone, it seems like, is interested, you should attend in person, because there's not going to be any recording of the other students. We are going to not have any quizzes next week. So today's quiz was the last quiz before break, but then we'll start quizzes again after break. And so I'll just point out, like, the quizzes can cover the papers that are being presented on. So for doing well in the quizzes, so that you don't have to cram and try and which you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to use external sources anyway on the quizzes, but you shouldn't cram in the 15 minutes that your quiz is to try to skim through one of these papers. You should attend the presentations, and you can learn all about the papers that way. Let me think. Other administrative things I'm wanting to bring up. Also, like, an advertisement for next Monday's lecture is Professor Jenkins will, at the end of it, after the student presenters give a presentation, we'll give a talk, like a brief talk on how to review papers. So just additional information to consider for reviewing papers from really an expert. Tuesday, not Monday. I'm sorry, Tuesday. We have lectures Tuesdays and Thursdays. Yes, Tuesday lecture. Is there something else you'd like to add? Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I just want to ask people, how you doing? Are people feeling okay? I'm really glad people came out and spending time with us, both online and in person. And if you have any comments or questions, or you just need somebody to listen, I'm always happy to take time. My email and Slack response time is a little slow this semester, more slow than it usually is. Anthony can tell you about that. But feel free to just come and say hi. And I just want to say that real quick, and then I'll pass back to Anthony.
And I'll actually add, it was funny when I was just purely a student. Professors would always say oh, I'm really bad at answering emails, and I always sort of wrote it off as oh yeah, they're so busy they can't answer my emails. But now that I'm getting closer to that direction, I actually can relate. So I'm really bad at answering your all emails, and I know that, and I'm trying to do my best. So when we sit, so we're doing our best with the emails. Any administrative questions or things people are concerned about that they want to bring up for the whole class? Scheduling wise, quiz wise, project wise. Yeah, so the intention is everyone should be involved in the presentation, but we don't have strict requirements that everybody do the same number of slides or everybody talk on every single slide for some amount of, like, there's no strict requirements. So we'll leave that up to you to sort of figure out in your groups. If you're having issues in your groups or if you want some advice, just some feedback on how to present, office hours are a great time for that. So, you know, Huiji's office hours, my office hours, Professor Jenkins has separate office hours that I think are on Wednesdays. From 3 to 5 on Wednesdays that you could also get feedback for. So yeah, good question.
Let me offer some, I don't know if we've talked about presentation style or anything like that, but let me offer the 5 key elements of a good presentation. First thing you start off with is what's called a hot start. So do something to get people's attention. It can be related to what you're talking about or not related. Could be a joke, could be an interesting question. Just get people's attention so they'll actually pay attention to the thing that you want to say. The next thing that you do is you have a value proposition. So if you're presenting a research paper, usually what you have is something that says, if we can solve problem X, we can get this great benefit Y. And that's why you're reading the paper to begin with. So that really is sort of like, why should I care, and what's going to be the benefit if for me to solve this problem? The next part is sort of the methods, the approach. And so what's the key insight Z that lets you attack problem X so that you can realize benefit Y? How are you going to do that? What are the key insights? How are we going to go about solving this problem? What's the new thing that this paper has to offer? Then you show the resolution, your results. That really shows off like how those are the things that you show that demonstrate how much of this benefit you've realized. By taking this new approach Z to problem X, look how much of the benefit Y we've been able to uncover and unlock. And then you have at the end what you have is the call to action. The call to action is look at these great things that we've done. Here we can take these steps forward to do more, or this is how you build on the results that we've done so that you can do this for yourself. And so if you think about those 5 parts, hot start, value proposition, methods, resolution, and results, and then the call to action, you can kind of split that up amongst your team and go back and forth. So you don't have to go slide to slide to slide to slide or break it up in some hard distinction, but you can always say, now that I've introduced the problem, my colleague, my partner, teammate is going to now tell you about the next step. That's one way to think about the flow. Does that make sense? All right.
And I guess one more thing to add, which is always like, I struggle with a lot in making my slides is actually, and this is counterintuitive for engineers, I think, but the less math, usually the better. There's a caveat there, which is like if the key insight is if the key insight is like a new loss function, you need math to describe that. But generally speaking, I think for these short presentations, for these kind of conference style presentations, like you're just trying to get across the idea, really, not to the level that someone can walk away with a working re-implementation of the entire paper. That's not the main goal. One slide of math.
For every 10 to 15 slides.
For every 10 to 15 slides, yeah, that's it, yeah. So like one slide of math in these presentations. Yeah, okay, yeah. All right. Yeah, other questions on presentations, and then we'll move on just so we keep on track. Okay, cool. So yeah, so today's lecture, we're gonna be following up on last time where we're gonna extend our discussion of RCNN, the object detector, to look at fast RCNN, faster RCNN, mask RCNN, and get into it. So just as a brief recap, so last time you'll recall what we started our discussion with was this concept of transfer learning in kind of 2 cases. There was one case where you could take a pre-trained network, take the weights out from it, and then train some linear classifier on the very highest level extracted features. So you could train like an SVM or maybe like a final linear layer classifier, like a fully connected layer classifier, using the output features that you got from this pre-trained frozen network. Or in the fine-tuning case of transfer learning, you could take these pre-trained weights and then train the entire pre-trained weights plus some new randomly initialized final fully connected layer as a way to transfer from image classification to a lot of other tasks. And so we saw then how image classification kind of extends beyond just classification, but to even localization tasks like object detection, which we started talking about in last lecture. And so today's lecture is going to be a continuation of that, where we're going to build on the concepts that we saw in RCNN, so the region-based CNN network, to try to improve the performance in a few ways, not just in terms of accuracy or in terms of that mean average precision of our object detector, but also in terms of the runtime of our object detector and the memory consumption, which are also important performance metrics that deep learning often has to confront. So, okay, so as a brief recap of what we saw in RCNN. So the core idea of RCNN was not too dissimilar from our classification networks. So the main distinction was we had as like the kind of first layer, what we would do is we would pass the input image into some region of interest proposal algorithm, which we treated like a black box. And so this algorithm would actually propose, based on some heuristics, a set. In the RCNN case, it was a set of size 2,000 bounding box regions of interest where there might be some object within the image. And then based on each of those regions of interest, we would crop the corresponding pixel features out of those regions, rescale them down into some canonical size, so some 224 by 224 spatial resolution size. And then each one of those sort of in parallel would get fed to some convolutional neural net backbone, which would be the same convolutional neural network for every single one of these regions of interest. So you could use, for example, like an AlexNet backbone on every single one of these regions of interest to then extract some features where those final features then would be passed through two final heads, a classification head, which would try to take the image features or the image patch features and predict what the category is corresponding to this specific region, or either the category or whether it's a background case. And then a second kind of like prediction head that would try to regress a bounding box transform, which would transform from the region of interest's proposed coordinates into the kind of ground truth coordinates corresponding to an actual object over that region of interest. And so this was really the core idea of region-based CNN, and region-based CNN was really the first convolutional neural network that was very successful as an object detector. But having said that, because it was the first, there were a lot of improvements that then follow-on work was able to actually achieve. So the first thing maybe that we might want to improve based on this region-based CNN architecture is the actual computational efficiency, right? So one observation we can make is we could think about maybe a potential case where if we have 2,000 regions of interest being proposed on this image, it's very likely going to be the case that if there's only a couple of objects in the images, a lot of these regions of interest are going to have a lot of overlapping pixels. And so correspondingly, if you kind of crop out these regions of interest, which have a lot of overlapping pixels, and then pass each one of them through this convolutional neural net backbone, a lot of that computation ends up being redundant because so many of the pixel features were actually overlapping in these original regions of interest that you're sort of like doing a huge amount of work in this parallel like feature extraction that you might not need to actually do. And how might you not need to do it? Well, maybe if you could reduce how many proposed regions you're generating, or if you could reduce how much overlap at least there is in those proposed regions. And so this kind of like takeaway, this idea maybe which we could try to extend RCNN with is these overlapping regions cause a lot of redundant, like repetitive work. And so maybe we can try and avoid this. And so this actually is like a legitimate like downside with RCNN. So in modern times, sometimes what the original RCNN paper will actually be referred to as like slow RCNN because if you think about it, right, like just to evaluate one single image at test time, you're having to run AlexNet 2,000 times, assuming you use the AlexNet backbone. If you use a more computationally expensive backbone, it's going to just go even higher, right? Like your overall cost at test time is going to be even higher. So it actually like legitimately is a pretty big expense having all these regions of interest being proposed with potentially overlapping features. So how might we try to improve this? Well, there was a paper followed on from RCNN by some of the same authors, and they had the great name of Fast RCNN because they specifically try and address this problem by making the architecture faster. So how did they do it? Well, the core insight is maybe what we could try and do is try to like extract features at the image level that will then be shared for all of the proposed regions. Because if you remember from some of those, from some of the discussion in the CNN architecture lecture, most of the computation, most of the heavy computation for convolutional neural networks ends up being in the first few layers, where you have a huge number of channels. And so you have a huge number of actual like convolution, like sliding passes that you have to do because you have so many filters in those early layers. So the insight is, if we just take out basically like the very heavy compute portions of our backbone and run them at the entire image level, maybe then if we take the resulting image features and try to propose regions in the resulting image feature level, we'll have less redundant work in these early stages of the convolutional backbone. So that's exactly what FastRCNet does. So it'll take your backbone and run it on the full image a single time, as opposed to like 2,000 times in parallel. So one time we run this convolutional network, we get out a feature map, and then at the same time what we do is we still run our region of interest proposer, so our black box algorithm on the original input image. But instead of cropping down at the pixel level the features that we get from that region of interest algorithm, now what we're going to do is crop out the corresponding bounding boxes based on the receptive field calculations at the feature level, at this extracted feature level. And so in doing so, you're sort of like reusing a huge amount of the feature extraction work that you're doing just one time instead of n times for all of for the total number of n, let's say, regions of interest you have proposed. So at that point then, once you've calculated somehow, which we'll look at how to do it, but somehow you're going to calculate using the receptive field information where the original regions of interest which were computed on the color image, where those map to at the feature level image, and then you're going to follow the exact same process as RCNet. So you're going to crop out those portions of the feature map, you're going to rescale them down to some canonical size, and then for each of them you're going to pass them through a classification head and also a bounding box, like transformation head to try to regress the output bounding box for each of these proposed regions of interest. And so what we can kind of think about is like that this per region network, if we make it very small, then overall we'll be getting a huge amount of speed up just by this notion that most of the work is happening in the early layers of our convolutional network. And so then the intuition goes that we can afford to make these classification heads and these regression heads smaller because they're now computing on the extracted features and not on the raw pixel level input, as was happening in RCNN. So one example of how like you could actually implement this in practice, still using the same sort of backbones we've talked about, is just like you could take AlexNet and instead of using the entire AlexNet as your per region, both like feature extractor and classifier, now what you could do is sort of chop like a portion of AlexNet, like maybe most of the convolutional layers in AlexNet, and use just a single instance of that network as your feature extractor, and then take maybe like the final linear layers and use those just as the per region classifiers and regressors. So that is FastRCNet, and that really is the core of FastRCNet. You don't have to use AlexNet, so you can instead use ResNet and kind of follow a similar approach, where you'll pick somewhere in the network, probably somewhere around the point at which the convolutions stop, like the 2D convolutions stop being layers, and you'll use that corresponding portion of ResNet as your backbone feature extractor, and then the linear layers, or like the one-by-one convolution layers, as your per region networks. And so the key, though, technical detail, though, that we would have to be able to actually implement if we wanted to reproduce the results from FastRCNN is this stage. So this is probably the stage that's a little bit vague, right? So this idea that, okay, you have regions of interest maybe that are proposed based on the original RGB image. How do you actually calculate where those bounding boxes at the pixel level would map into this higher level feature space? Because that's the core step we would need in order to actually take this idea and re-implement it. So how do we crop these features? Well, the key idea, or like the key like knowledge that we need is going back to that discussion we had on receptive fields and how you can calculate for all the layers we've talked about what the input receptive field is for a given feature in the output feature map. So for example, like let's take the case of a 3x3 convolution layer with a stride of 1 and a padding size of 1. So if we just have a single layer like that, we saw how the input and output size is going to be preserved, right? Because we have the padding and that stride, with that 3x3 size kernel, if we have some input image into this layer, which is 8x8, let's say, in the spatial resolution, the output feature map that we're going to get is also going to be 8x8. And so correspondingly, what that means is we can, for any given point within the output feature map, we know exactly which input features, based on the kernel size, fell into the receptive field of this output feature. So in other words, like for this one output feature at this location, we know that the corresponding pixels which were seen during the convolution stage to produce that output feature fall within this green box. So you can calculate exactly what the sort of bounding box is of the receptive field in the input space based on some given location in the output space. And we also saw how like this notion of a receptive field can be sort of chained together. So like we can actually produce the math that would predict for if you started layering, like putting multiple layers together, you can actually directly calculate for some given like feature point in the output space, what's the corresponding receptive field in the input space. So even if you have, like in this case, two 3x3 convolution layers together, in this case the receptive field is larger, but we have the math to actually be able to predict this. So the insight then is we can use some of this math in that cropping of the feature map for FastRCNN to implement that core component. And so another kind of insight here, or like something that's maybe worth thinking about, is at least in this case, we have like a 3x3, like two 3x3 convolutions chained together. Moving one pixel location, let's say in either of the two dimensions in the output feature map, will correspondingly move your receptive window one pixel in the corresponding dimension of the input image. That might not be the case if you introduce like a max pulling operation, but the insight from these like simple cases at least is like we can actually create a mapping, so an actual like correspondence for every single point in the input space in terms of the 2D dimensions of the spatial input space to the corresponding spatial dimensions in the output space. So we could, in other words, compute a transform given some network architecture that would map every single point within the input space into a corresponding point within the output space, and vice versa. So this is useful, and what's also useful is to think about like the fact that if we have this mapping, it's not only a mapping for like the discrete pixel coordinates, but it can extend also if we were to treat these spatial dimensions as continuous. And so this will be useful because for certain networks, and in fact for probably most complicated networks, what's going to end up happening is because once you start introducing downsampling, your output size in most complicated networks ends up being smaller than your input size in the spatial dimension. And as a consequence of that, what ends up happening is for specific coordinates which might fall on the pixel locations in the input space, that's going to actually fall not on the specific pixel grid in the output space. So in other words, the specific input feature maybe at column like number 10 and row number 20 might fall in the output feature space at some point that's now a continuous value. So it might be like at pixel location 3.2 in the columns and like 4.7, I'm kind of making up numbers, but like 4.7 in the rows. And so that is going to introduce a bit of a challenge, which we'll look at how we can deal with. But the main takeaway is we can project any given point from a coordinate of the input to the output and vice versa, from the output back to the input, based on the specific layers that make up a given CNN architecture. So like this is a mapping that we'll know how to produce. Okay, and so why this might be useful then is if we go back and think about what FastRCNN is really doing, the region of interest network, what it's going to do is we're going to give it the input image, right? And it's going to give us some set of bounding boxes still. So it's some black box algorithm that'll give us a set of bounding boxes. And so what FastRCNN is going to want is it's going to want to know what, for a given bounding box on the input image, where does that bounding box fall on some feature map that's been output by our AlexNet feature extractor. So what we can do is using like our knowledge of the receptive fields for the given, let's say, AlexNet feature extractor, is we can map every single coordinate in the bounding box. So like the 4 corners in the bounding box from the input image, we can map to the feature space and then correspondingly extract the features from the feature space that fall within that projected bounding box and use those then as input features to our classification head and our regression head. So in a practical level, this is how fast RCNN is actually implemented. And so once you're able to actually do this projection from a bounding box, which is the region of interest at the image level, to a bounding box at the feature level, then what you have to be able to do is decide how it is you're going to actually kind of crop out those features from the feature map for feeding them into your classification heads. Let me pause and see, before we talk about how we're going to actually convert the features into some canonical shape so that we can feed them to our classification and regression heads, let me pause and see what questions I can answer on this notion of projecting points from the input to the output feature maps. Everyone believes me when I say we can define some mapping for pixel coordinates from the input into feature coordinates in the output, and vice versa. Everyone's on board? Okay. Because that's a key, this is like the key part of fast RCNN, really. Yeah, so the question was, like, if you have like an input, in this case, like the input's 8 by 8, and then we're saying, because in this case we have a 4 by 4 max pool, the output is 2 by 2, won't essentially any bounding box in the input give you a bounding box? Like, if the bounding box covers most, I think, of the input is what you're asking, won't every bounding box in the output cover all the 2 by 2 features? That's what you're asking. So the answer to that is, that is true if the bounding box on your input covers most of the 8 by 8. If it covers most of the 8 by 8, then the projection is still going to be covering most of the 2 by 2. But even in this case, what we're showing here, like this bounding box on this 8 by 8, you can see it covers probably, like, I don't know, it's probably roughly like half of the area of this input image. But the corresponding projection doesn't fall along like the overall 2 by 2 like receptive size, because we're not rounding. So what this projection lets us do is treat the coordinate spaces, both in the input and the output, not as discrete locations, but as like a continuous range. And so because of that, you can see like the projection of like this upper left corner from the input bounding box is not being rounded to maybe like coordinate 0, 0 in the feature map. We're actually retaining, like, as a floating point where it falls on this, treating like the horizontal and the vertical dimensions of those feature map dimensions as continuous dimensions. You're questioning why the output feature map doesn't increase in size if we're using padding, is that right? We're not considering basically like the boundary of your receptive field, we're just considering like up to the center feature in your receptive field for doing this projection in fast RCNN. So why don't we scale the bounding box in the output image? What do you mean by scale it? So it's just, so the question is how are we doing this projection of the points? We're just using the, essentially like the hyperparameters of the given layers in the network controls what the shape of inputs and outputs is. And so from that, you can calculate for every single pixel location in the input for some given layer, where will the output pixel location be like centered on the center of the kernel. So we're just using that knowledge to do this projection. So the specific equations we have written back, I think it's in the CNN, architecture lecture, or it might be one before that, if you want to go back and refer to those equations. For the bounding boxes, we have 4 coordinate locations in the input describing a bounding box. We have like the upper left corner, upper right corner, lower left, lower right. So then what we do is, for each of those are just given as pixel coordinate locations. So those are numbers that fall somewhere. Each one has a 2D horizontal location and vertical location in the spatial dimensions of the input image. And let's treat them not just as discrete pixel coordinates, but actually as like somewhere falling on a continuous scale along the vertical and horizontal dimensions of the input image. we map those, we pass those through whatever this function is, which projects them into the output feature map. And so they're still going to have some coordinate now along the output feature map's horizontal and vertical dimensions that says where this input feature was the center feature of the receptive field at a specific feature in the output feature map. Yeah. Okay. So let's say that we can project these points using our knowledge of the specific layers and the hyperparameters that went into the layers within our architecture. And let's then think about how we can use this now to set up our canonical sized input to the final classification and regression heads, which we want. So let's imagine we have some input image, and let's say it's a fairly large input image. So it's the 3 color channels and then 640 in the width, 480 in the height. We pass it through our feature extractor, and let's just hypothetically say that we'll end up with 512 channels that has a spatial resolution of 20 by 15. So like 20 like a size of 20 in the width for this feature map and a height of 15. So let's say then, just hypothetically, because this is kind of like a small case so we can fit it on the slides, but let's say that what we want from these output image features is for this one region of interest, which we have highlighted on the slide, we want a canonical shaped feature vector or feature map that would correspond to this region of interest and have a spatial size of 2 by 2. So the reason we want this 2 by 2 spatial size is because for our final classification head and regression head, they are always going to take in the same size. So no matter whether it's this region of interest or maybe there's a separate region of interest for like the sky or another region of interest for the cat's tail, those aspect ratios might be different. The sizes of those regions of interest might be different. But before we can feed any of the extracted feature maps to our classification and regression heads, we need to make them some canonical shape. We need to like normalize their shape. So in this example, we're picking 2 by 2 in the spatial dimensions as the normalized shape that our classification and regression heads are going to be taking as input. Before now we show how we can do this, does that setup make sense? Like why we would want to have a canonical shape output for these, like for the features that we're extracting for this region of interest? Exactly, right. So what FastRCNN will do, for no matter what the region of interest's aspect ratio is or size is, it will constrain the feature maps that go into the classification and regression heads will always be the same shape. Because the classification and regression heads are shared. It's the same network for no matter what the region of interest is. So we need to somehow normalize the shapes of features that are going into those two heads. Question? Okay, so the question is, so when you're training, so given that that's how we're going to approach this like classification and regression head, during training, will we be doing reshaping to make sure, is the question reshaping of the input image to make sure that the regions of interest are all the same on the input side? Or, because we'll get to the training, part, but at a high level, FastRCNN, and this is sort of a downside which later networks will try to accommodate, which we'll see, but FastRCNN ignores the important information, which is the aspect ratio and the size of the region of interest for the classification regression heads. Later networks, which we'll look at, will fix this problem. Like the reason that's kind of a problem, or maybe like a pitfall of FastRCNN, is that there can be a lot of useful information for classification in the aspect ratio of the region of interest, because certain objects have certain like relative sizes in their horizontal and vertical dimensions, which gets captured, or in the case of FastRCNN, destroyed using this ROI pool layer. So what does the ROI pool layer do? So what it's going to do for this region of interest is it's going to project the coordinates from the input spatial dimensions into the feature map spatial dimensions. So you can see like this green box now has been projected into the feature map. And then correspondingly, we're going to, what ROI pool does, which is the layer used in FastRCNN, is it will round those what were continuous coordinates that were projected. It'll round them to the nearest locations of the feature map grid. So this is another downside of ROI pool that will hopefully be fixed in a later on network. But at this point, at least, it has this sort of projection and rounding. So it at least knows like, okay, these are this like sort of sub window in the feature map that hopefully relates to the region of interest in the pixel level. And other than the rounding, this is the region that maps to the original input region of interest portion of the image. So at that point then, what RY-pool will do, which is used within FastRCNN, is it's going to divide this region of interest, no matter what the shape is, no matter what the size is in the feature map side, it's going to define a 2x2 grid over this shape. So it's going to try to sort of make the grid evenly sized in the vertical and the horizontal dimensions, but you can see if the aspect ratio of this region of interest, once it's been projected, is not square, more features in the feature map fall into some of these grid cells than other grid cells. But at that point then what it does is it will perform a max pooling operation along each of the channel dimensions within each of these like subdivided windows, so that the final output size that we'll get is a 2x2 by the number of channels, so in this case 512 channels. So a 512 by 2x2 feature map, which is now going to be fed to the classification head and to the bounding box regression head for the final decision on whether this region of interest actually is an object. So that's how FastRCNN will actually canonicalize or kind of like normalize the input-sized feature maps to the final classification and regression heads. The problem, which has been brought up now, is that there's going to be a slight misalignment in this projected feature map because of the rounding that the RY-pool does, because it was rounding from the continuous mapped coordinates into these like fixed grid cell coordinates. So that's one issue. The other issue is that like this subdividing approach is sort of weird, because it's like you're sort of like describing maybe like large portions of the input region of interest with fewer features than smaller portions. So again, like this is another potential source of like seemingly like that could cause a problem. It seems like you would want every portion of the original input region of interest to sort of be equally represented in the features that are going to be used for classifying what that region of interest was containing. And so it turns out that in a later paper, MaskRCNN, there was a modification to ROI-pool proposed that fixed these two problems. And so ROI align is what you'll be implementing in project 3. Take it back, project 3. And let's see how this fixes it. So what ROI align is going to try and do is it's going to try to, first of all, not round the projected pixel coordinates of your bounding box. And then secondly, it's going to use interpolation instead of the pooling to actually try and represent portions of the input image, like kind of representatively. Okay, so to start with, so what ROI align will do is it's going to project the original input coordinates of the bounding box into the feature space, and then it's going to leave them as continuous valued coordinates, even though they're not going to necessarily fall along the grid positions in your feature map. So at this point then, given, let's say, like ROI align will still try to produce some fixed canonical sized output feature map, it will subdivide the projected bounding box in the feature map according to that output size that you want, but it's going to subdivide your input image precisely such that each of the subsized windows have an equal area in the feature map. So in this case, like we want a 2x2 output, ROI align will make sure that each of the 2x2 subdivided kind of windows in this feature map region of interest have the same area over the feature map spatial dimensions. So it's going to try to represent every portion of the input image with the same feature information, at least up to this point. But now we have this issue of how are we actually going to decide, because like these coordinates which are dividing the region of interest in the feature map level, but also like these subdivided windows within this feature map, we somehow still have to extract the features from these continuous valued coordinates. So how are we going to do that? Well, what ROI align proposes to do is to actually interpolate within these continuous valued coordinates, to interpolate the features that are included within these according to how many, basically like according to what the continuous values of these bounding box coordinates are. Okay, so what does interpolation mean? Interpolation is essentially like kind of like an averaging operation where you will average information based on, in this case, like the location or the proximity of features to a given coordinate. So what our line will do is for each of these subdivided windows in the feature map, it's going to pick a certain number of a fixed set of samples that, once again, don't fall necessarily along the grid positions of the feature map. And then it's going to interpolate for every one of these samples within this window. It's going to interpolate what the corresponding feature vector would sort of be on average for each of these points based on the grid of feature maps of feature vectors that are around these points. So I know it's kind of confusing. So maybe like a better way to look at that is by working through an example. So if we look at this window in the overall like subdivided, like if we look at this overall, sorry, if we look at one sample, this one green sample point, what we're trying to do in our line is describe this one point, which does not fall at a specific grid location in the feature map, with a single vector, a single feature vector, which is based on information in the neighboring cells, which do fall along a fixed grid size dimension. So if we expand the neighboring cells, which are feature vectors in the feature map, we could sort of visualize it like this. So these gray points are the center coordinates on the grid, on the fixed grid sized feature map. And then this green point is the sampled, which we want to kind of describe with just a single feature vector based on these neighboring cells. And what interpolation is going to do is it's going to base that feature vector, which is describing this green point, based on the proximity of the green point to these neighboring cells. So the idea is that since this green point is closer in proximity to these two bottom cells, in some sense, they should be more kind of like higher weighted in the representation of the green point than these higher cells, because these higher cells are further away. That's the whole idea of interpolation. You're sort of like trying to use information that's more local, you're trying to weight it more heavily. And so this equation written here is what actually performs that. So it's a little bit of, like stepping through it is a little bit easier to understand this equation than like kind of going over the Greek. But what the summation here is doing is it's summing over the four nearest neighbor cells for a specific sample. So in this case, this fxy, this is the feature vector that we want to describe at some given continuous valued coordinate xy. So in other words, fxy is the feature vector we want to describe the green point, which is one of our samples. And then we're going to sum over the four neighboring feature map cells. And for each one of those, what we're going to do is we're going to consider the feature vector which exists at one of those cells, which would be, for example, like f65. And we're going to basically accumulate the f65 according to how close it is to this output coordinate xy. And so that's what then this internal equation here is doing. So we're taking the max between 0 and 1 minus the distance from the, from the coordinate of interest to the coordinate of the specific feature point that we're kind of considering within the summation. So in this case, what this equation really is doing is it's saying like, okay, the specific coordinate the specific sample point that we're interested in producing an output feature vector for is 0.5 units in the x dimension away from f65, and it's 0.8 units away from that grid cell in the vertical dimension. And so correspondingly, we're going to sort of scale what the contribution of f65's vector is based on those distances. So the 1 minus within these two equations is to ensure that feature points that are closer are weighted more highly. That's all the 1 minus is doing. And then the max is just to make sure that we're not actually like removing feature, like that we don't ever have like a negative scalar. That's why we have the max operation. And so we do this summation over all 4 points. So if you sort of work through the math, you can actually like draw out what these deltas are going to be in the horizontal and vertical dimensions and work it all out. And so I'll leave these in the slides. I'm not going to like step through all the math for that. But at the end of this equation, what you're going to end up with for this one sampled feature point is just a vector, which is some linear combination based on these distances of the nearest 4 features in the grid map. That's the main takeaway. So I'll just point out like the fact that this kind of seems like a lot of math and like a very nuanced here. points out like it's kind of a pain to implement. Like these layers are very nuanced in their implementation, but having said that, they are very fast. So one reason why bilinear interpolation is favored is it has this nice property of kind of mixing information based on some preference, and in this case, it's the localization preference, like how close features are. But it's also very fast once it's been implemented. There's not a whole lot of compute required for bilinear interpolation. I'll also point out that bilinear interpolation is a general concept that's used outside of just ROI align. So it's really useful for downsampling images, downsampling feature maps if you want to just like shrink them. And so it's useful outside of just ROI align, but it is a key feature of ROI align. Okay, so coming back to where we are. So let's say that we've implemented our bilinear interpolation correctly. What ultimately is going to happen is once we have sampled some set number of points within each of these subdivided windows, and we've run bilinear interpolation, at that point what we would end up is for this window, which doesn't fit, once again, right, over the feature map exactly in terms of like grid, like discrete grid coordinates, we're going to have 4 feature vectors, right? We're going to have like one feature vector for this sample, one feature vector for this sample, another one for this one, and another one for this one. The final step then to represent this overall region as just one feature vector in our output feature map is to do a max pool over those 4 sampled feature vectors, which we produce from bilinear interpolation. So once again, so just like overall what the process is you take your input region of interest, you project the coordinates into your feature map's spatial dimensions, you subdivide that projected bounding box into a discrete set of sub-windows based on the size of the output you want. So you'll have one sub-window for every spatial kind of like feature pixel of output you want. You pick some discrete number of samples within each of the sub-windows, run bilinear interpolation on those, and then max pool within each sub-window to produce each of the one kind of like feature pixels of output. So one pixel in your output feature map here maps back to one of these sub-windows and is a summary of the features that existed within these sub-windows. And then that sub-window correspondingly maps back to some portion of the original input image. So I know that's like a lot of kind of going through, but that's how ROI align works. And so the nice thing about ROI align is it fixes those 2 issues, right, that we pointed out with ROI pooling, which FastRCNN used. So we're no longer rounding this projected bounding box in the feature map space, and at the same time, like our subdivided windows now, because we're not forcing them to fall along the grid dimensions, can kind of fall like kind of along equidistant subdivisions, and then correspondingly still produce a canonical output size. So it has like all these nice properties, and it contributed to maskRCNN outperforming FastRCNN. Okay, so coming back to what the whole point of that ROI line really was, at this point, right, where ROI line fits in is in this core step of FastRCNN. So what it will do, right, is FastRCNN takes in the input image, runs the region of interest algorithm on top of it, and then runs the input image one time through your feature extractor, and then using that ROI line, or in the case of pure FastRCNN, the ROI pool step, it would extract the features of interest from your feature map, rescale them down to some canonical size based on maybe the interpolation from ROI align, and then each one of those would in parallel get fed to some classification head and some bounding box regression head in parallel. And that is in contrast then to the slow RCNN that we looked at in last time. So just how much of an improvement was this implementation? Because remember, that was the whole goal for FastRCNN, was just to improve the runtime. And it turns out that it is actually a pretty substantial improvement, not only at test time, but also during training. So here you can see the results, like during training time of the original RCNN, took 84 hours, and then to achieve similar performance, if not better performance, FastRCNN, you can see it was like 1/10 of the amount of time in training. At test time, the difference is even more extreme. You can see here that RCNN, so this is showing the blue boxes here are showing just the region proposal process, and then the red box is showing if you are considering like the runtime outside of the region proposal process. So that's, remember, like that heuristic algorithm that's running on top of the neural network. So So RCNN, you can see most of the compute was actually, because of the red bar is so large, most of the compute was always in the neural network portions, not in the heuristic algorithm. Fast RCNN, in contrast, almost all of the test time compute of fast RCNN is going to that heuristic algorithm. It's not even going to the neural network. So this is really kind of quite a result, but it does suggest maybe that if you wanted to improve fast RCNN even further, at least at test time, you would have to be removing or somehow changing that heuristic algorithm, because that's what's taking all the time, right? Like the neural network here, the 0.32 seconds is like what, a very small fraction of the overall time that the fast RCNN is taking. And so this then kind of motivated the move to what's called faster RCNN, with the goal of trying to remove this heuristic algorithm to further improve maybe the accuracy or like the detection performance, but also even the runtime. If we could maybe remove this heuristic algorithm and let it be learned from data with some neural network. So as I kind of gave away, the name of the follow-on work, also from some of the same authors, was faster RCNN, and its goal was really to do just that. It was trying to remove that heuristic region of interest proposal network, or proposal algorithm, and the way it did that was with the region of interest proposal network, the RPN, as a substitute. And so now, like, the high-level goal is, can we learn how to propose regions of interest as opposed to using some heuristic, some handcrafted, engineered algorithm? And otherwise, though, the algorithm itself is the exact same as fast RCNN. So you can see that these changes from RCNN to fast RCNN to now faster RCNN, they're not completely re-engineering the system. They're making sort of subtle but very precise changes based on the results that have been seen up to that point. And I would say that's generally a trend that you'll see quite a bit, even outside of the detection. So for example, like when we talk about point cloud, like we're gonna go from PointNet to PointNet++. So there's probably a lot of overlap between the two, where the advances or like the extensions and the follow-on works are guided by some of the early, are guided by like a lot of the early designs, but then trying to sort of improve them or supplement the architectures to fix some of the downsides. So pointing out architecturally what faster RCNN looks like. So we're gonna have our input image, we're gonna pass it into a neural network. It will extract features at the image level, so just like a single time it will run through this network. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take those features and hopefully pass them through some other neural network that will generate proposed regions. And so we'll look at how that's trained. And at that point then it's just fast RCNN. So once we have proposed regions, we can go back to our feature map, we can map the proposed regions into the feature map spacing, we can canonicalize them with ROI pool or ROI align, and then run our classification and regression heads in parallel. Okay, so what does this region proposal network in faster RCNN look like? Well, once again, so the original kind of setup is the same. So we're gonna have some input image, it'll get passed through some convolutional neural network backbone to extract features. So in this case, let's say that our CNN gives us 512 channels of features that are 5 by 6 in the spatial dimensions. So I think in this case, it's 5 pixels of height and 6 pixels in the width of the feature map. And at this point then, what the region proposal network does is it's gonna define what it calls a set of anchors. So what this is gonna look like is using our like the mappings that we talked about for projecting from the input space to the output space. What you can imagine doing is for every single pixel or for every single point in the feature map, we could map back what the corresponding center of the receptive field was in the input image. So what this diagram is showing is exactly that. So these gray points are sort of like a one-to-one correspondence of the center of the receptive field for one of these given locations in the feature map. And if we imagine defining for each one of these points that have been projected back into the input image, imagine defining some fixed size bounding box that's centered on each of those points and call that an anchor, then the kind of intuition here is maybe we could use the feature vector, which we get from this location in the feature map, to try to kind of predict, is this hypothetical anchor, which is back in the input image, is that a good would that be a good proposed region of interest? And so maybe we could try to like define a classifier that would take just this feature vector and predict whether the corresponding hypothetical anchor in the input image is like a region that we should consider of interest. That's the intuition. And so that's how the region proposal network is ultimately going to work. So now we just have to kind of figure out how can we set that intuition up as a training objective. Let me think. Before going on, does this notion of an anchor make sense? So you can kind of imagine, like for every one of these different points within the feature map, you're gonna have a separate anchor. So I'm just kind of flipping through 3 here. But again, in this case, they're all fixed size. Like the anchors have been preset as what the size are. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, if you have some really deep convolutional network, maybe with a lot of convolutional features and maybe a lot of max pooling, won't the receptive field for a given point in the feature map be very large, maybe even larger than what we're showing as these anchors? And the answer is yes, but what you can imagine doing is like, even if the receptive field for this feature that's shown, even if the receptive field, let's just hypothetically say is the whole image, we could still set up, like we could still try to set up a training objective so that this feature, like the final, let's say, like layer that will take this feature's input and predict whether the corresponding anchor is an object or not, or of interest or not, it can use the entire receptive field to still decide that. But if our training objective uses labels that always are based on this fixed size anchor, like maybe it can focus on just the anchor, which is a subportion of the receptive field. Now, I think the argument's harder the other way, which is, what if the receptive field is smaller than your anchor size? Then I think it's probably harder for these features to learn. But generally speaking, the receptive field will be larger than your anchor box size. Yeah, good, really interesting question. Okay, so we have this definition of an anchor. So it's this mapping from some given coordinate in the feature map back to now a window, some fixed window size in the input image. And our training objective, what we're going to try to get some classifier to do, is to take every single one of these feature map vectors, every single one of these vectors within the feature map, so every single point within the feature map treating it as a vector, and to classify those features as corresponding to either a positive anchor, meaning there's an object within that anchor, or a negative anchor where there's no object. So in this example, for this particular anchor, the cat is not centered, it's not kind of fully encapsulated in the anchor. So maybe we would call this a negative example. Whereas for maybe this anchor, since the cat is at least, the vast majority of the cat is kind of enclosed within the anchor, we would try to train our final classifier to classify the features at this specific point in the feature map as corresponding to, yes, a positive object, like one that we would want to consider for the downstream bounding box regression. Yeah. Just the features. So the idea here is like, let's say, and I think we'll talk about maybe what the architecture is, but let's hypothetically say that, like, so there's 512 channels in this feature map, right? So you could imagine taking this specific window, like this 1 pixel kind of window in the feature map, and that's a 512 vector, just vector. Imagine feeding that to a fully connected layer that tries to predict 2 scores, either like a positive score or a negative score. That's basically what the region proposal network is going to look like. So it's sort of like a 1-by-1 convolution. The anchor box for us, we're using the anchor box to set up an objective. The anchor box doesn't necessarily correspond exactly to the receptive field. So the receptive field at this point in the feature map could be bigger than the anchor box, depending on the network definition. It could be smaller than the anchor box, but in practice that won't happen. Like that would be hard, I think. But so let's just hypothetically say that the receptive field, so the actual input pixel features that were generated to produce this 1 point in the feature map, were bigger than the anchor. Like the network could kind of fully see the anchor pixels in the input image. Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that because so now for starting to train some of these detectors, it can become kind of tricky to actually implement the kind of data loading because you're gonna have to dynamically decide, given some loaded image, you're gonna have to dynamically decide whether or not every single anchor, which is sort of hypothetically based on our training setup being proposed, whether that's a positive example or negative example dynamically. I mean, in theory, you could pre-compute it and store it on disk, and then every time you load in an image, you could load in the labels for all the anchors. But in practice, it's not worth all that memory. You'll just dynamically compute it. So you'll load in the image, you'll see what the ground truth bounding box is, and then you're using IOU, the IOU metric, you can dynamically decide whether every anchor is positive or negative. And I think we'll talk a bit about that. Great question. Okay, so I don't see any other questions, so let's see. So now what this will look like, what this kind of anchor classifier will look like is we're gonna predict exactly how we just talked about. So what the output of this is gonna be, and it could be implemented even as a one-by-one convolution, is you're gonna produce two scores, so a score for the positive class, a score for the negative class, and then you're gonna have the same spatial dimension as your feature map. Because again, you're trying to predict, is there an object for every anchor located at every point in the feature map? So it's the same spatial dimension, whether or not there's a positive anchor or a negative anchor at every point in the feature map. You could, alternatively, I'll just point out, like you could implement this as outputting one value, just a single score, and then you would train it not with softmax, but with like some binary, like logistic regression, but they're equivalent. So the point is it's trying to classify just a binary problem of is there an object at this anchor or not. In addition to that, what faster RCNN also does is try to use the ground truth bounding box as additional training signal for this region proposal network. So the idea here is like this additional loss, which now we can incorporate, maybe might improve the region predictor network even more because this binary signal is can kind of be like pretty weak training signal. So what's maybe a little bit richer is saying like when you have positive cases, also try to have the region proposal network predict a transform that would transform this positive anchor into the ground truth bounding box. And so again, that should maybe give additional feedback to the network, kind of like help the training maybe get even better. So what this network will do is you'll have a parallel head that'll output a 4 by 5 by 6 output prediction. And so now these four channels correspond to the transform implemented the same way we talked about with RCNN. So it's a transform for the height, the width, and the center location of the anchor to hopefully the ground truth bounding box. And again, you'll only train this anchor transform network on positive examples. So negative examples just don't produce, like you don't train that through that network. Like you don't include that loss at all. But for positive examples, you would include the loss component for this anchor transform. Okay, I'll just point out now in practice, the way these networks are actually implemented is there's not just one anchor for every point in the feature map. Instead, what you do, because the downside with that is exactly kind of what we were talking about with like the ROI pooling, but just like in the inverse direction, which is if your anchors are maybe always square and of the same size, you'll have a hard time maybe detecting objects that are smaller or larger than your fixed size anchor. Or if the aspect ratio of a particular object class isn't square, then you'll have a hard time with those objects. So what's done in practice is you'll have some set, maybe like you'll have k choices for the size of your anchor, and then which could also be different aspect ratios, and then you'll try to predict a corresponding prediction of whether or not every single one of those anchors is an object or not at this specific location. So you'll increase your output predictions in terms of whether this corresponding anchor is an object or not, and also increase the size of your output for this transforms based on how many fixed size anchors you choose. This is a hyperparameter though. So like the engineer will have to pick how many of these differently shaped or differently sized anchors they want to represent. And usually I would say you'll want to sort of balance how much extra compute you're going to be forming at this layer versus what the benefit is if you instead used your compute at a downstream portion of the network. That's usually how you'll decide. Yeah. Okay. Question? Yeah. So the question is, do you want, like, can you train I think the question is, can you train like faster RCNN on a data set maybe that doesn't have cats, but then still have it detect cats after you've trained it on some other classes? Is that the question? As long as it follows the same like aspect ratio and things like that. The answer, so this seems like a general purpose detector, but it's actually not, because it will still kind of, it's still gonna, because we're gonna add on top of this the classification loss, which is trying to have these proposed regions be predicted as specific classes from some fixed set based on your data set definition. That's gonna incentivize this region proposal network to only propose regions from those fixed preset classes. So this proposal network, because of the ultimate classification loss, which will get incorporated in the overall training objective, it's going to kind of incentivize the network not to think that other objects outside of the data set are of interest. It's like, ignore these other objects, because otherwise you're going to make it harder on the classification layer, like the final classification head. Yeah, but you could probably transfer the features to the other data set. Okay, so yeah, so in terms of now how it is, like during training, how are we gonna set up this, like what is our actual data set? Well, what we'll do is when we load in an image and load in the ground truth bounding box, we'll use the IOU to decide whether or not all of these anchors would be positive or negative dynamically on the fly. So again, you'll pick some threshold here before training, so maybe like 0.7 is a common threshold. Any ground truth bounding box that has an IOU greater than your positive threshold with some of the anchors, we'll describe those specific anchors as positive and all the others as negative. And then some anchors you'll describe as neutral if for all the ground truth labels in an image, they fall kind of within the positive and negative thresholds. And the intuition there is that those are kind of those are kind of tough cases. Like maybe you don't want to use training signal, like maybe you don't want to use those cases for training signal because it might kind of confuse the network. So just train the network on the very obvious cases. But again, because those are hand-picked hyperparameters, you could change them and you'll see different performance in your final network. Okay, so yeah, at test time then what you'll do is you'll pick some like threshold generally on how many anchors then you're gonna pass to your follow-on network. So usually what you'll do is you'll maybe sort all the anchors based on the score for whether or not they're predicted to be an object. And then based on some threshold, either you could pick a threshold on score or a threshold on the total number if you're more interested in the test time, like cost of inference at test time, then maybe you could just pick like a discrete number of your top predicted objects and then pass just those anchors on to the classification head and the regression head. But during training, I'll just point out that, if I go back a slide, during training, all 4 losses are added together. So during training, the overall objective is a sum of the region proposal network's classifications loss, the region proposal network's bounding box regression loss, and then the final classification loss and bounding box regression loss. So you just add them all together, and you can decide to scale them potentially if you want to prioritize one or the other. Maybe as training goes on, you would increase the weights on the final 2 losses, and because by then the region proposal network is probably pretty good. It's kind of a hyperparameter with how you train. But yeah, so now this is faster RCNN. So I'm gonna go kind of fast through the next part. Faster RCNN did further improve the runtime performance of fast RCNN. So but just by getting rid of that heuristic algorithm, you can see like the runtime at test goes down by like, what is that, an order of magnitude or more. So another huge improvement. And now what I wanted to talk about just briefly, and we're just gonna skim the surface of segmentation, but I wanted to talk about how you could extend faster RCNN to actually perform other tasks, like image segmentation in the form of instance segmentation. So let's look at that briefly. So what is instance segmentation? So instance segmentation is a task where you're given an input image and you want to detect all the objects of interest within that image. And also what you want is to predict which of the pixels in the image correspond to each of the objects. But what you don't do, and this is a distinction from like semantic segmentation, you're not going to predict pixels that are falling into like a broad class, like where you might have multiple objects. So in other words, you would, and this to some extent depends on how you define the data set, but with Instance segmentation, you're going to try to detect instances of a class. So in this case, you're detecting like, oh, here, these pink pixels are all the pixels that correspond to the Flips chocolate-covered pretzel bag. What you wouldn't do is detect like all of these pixels for these 3 different bags as being like products, and they're all falling into like a shared kind of class. So instance segmentation, you're trying to predict pixels for specific instances within a class, whereas in semantic segmentation, you might actually have labels for like all of the trees or all of the products, and you would have those pixels all be segmented in the same, with the same label. So the approach of mask RCNN, which is a nice kind of extension of faster RCNN, is to perform object detection and then just predict a mask for every detected object, right? So it's a very natural extension. And when I say it's a natural extension, I mean it truly is a natural extension. So what they're going to do is they're going to take faster RCNN, exactly how we've described it, and they're just going to add one more piece, which is a mask prediction head at the very end. So you're going to have still your region proposal network, you'll still have your classification head and your bounding box regression head at the end, but then the idea is, okay, for every region of interest that's been proposed, and for every single class that I'm considering, let's predict a binary mask that would be hopefully predicting a segmentation within the region of interest for all the classes that we're interested in. And you'll do that in parallel with the object classification and the bounding box regression. So let's kind of take a look at what that looks like. So let's say we're given some input image. We first pass it through our convolutional neural network feature extractor. We then go through ROI align. So mask RCNN is the paper that introduced ROI align. And now we're going to have a set of canonical sized feature maps for every region of interest, right? And so what faster RCNN was doing was this upper branch. So it was going to predict a classification score for all of those regions of interest, and also for each one of those regions of interest, it would predict a bounding box coordinate, right? What mask RCNN does, it still does those, so we still have those losses, but in addition, what it's going to do is it's going to take this feature map for this region of interest, you're going to pass it through some small convolutional neural network, and you're going to output a binary mask, which is 1 channel per class. So every single channel in this final predicted tensor that you're getting is representing a binary mask of some fixed size, so like maybe 28 by 28, and there's 1 binary mask per class. So during training, kind of similar to what we were talking about with the anchors, during training you only will train these binary masks with the specific class for this specific region of interest. So in other words, so even though the network will predict, let's say hypothetically we have 10 classes, the network will still predict a 10 by 28 by 28 output tensor for the segmentation output, but you'll actually only train through one of those channels based on the actual class that corresponds to this region of interest. So the network's doing quite a bit of kind of like extra work at the final layer, but your training signal is only going through the actual class, similar to how it was only going through the positive anchor. Question? The 28 by 28 is a hard-coded spatial resolution of those binary masks, which maps, depending on the convolutions that you're applying, but that maps directly back to the ROI aligned like spatial dimensions. So meaning it's one-to-one. So you can see in this case, we happen to be upsampling, but it could be downsampled too. So like these ROI aligned feature maps had a 14 by 14 spatial dimension in the feature maps. So this convolutional network here was actually upsampling those feature maps. But the main idea here is that what you can do with this binary mask is you can, because we know all the projections back to the input image, you can actually, and also we know like the original transformation of this bounding box back to the original input image, you can map every single one of these pixels in the predicted mask back to somewhere where it actually corresponds to in the input image. Yes. So because the resolution here, I mean, it can either relate to a group, so you might either have to upsample these bounding box binary masks or downsample them, depending on the network, depending on the CNN network here. So I'll just point out really quickly, like mask RCNN is extremely good. So it's still used very much so in practice. Mask RCNN is really, really good. There have been improvements, but mask RCNN, I would say, is still, it's been pre-trained so much at this point. It's a nice network to kind of take off the shelf and try on your first try. I'll also point out, because we're out of time, that it's been extended to other tasks. So even the authors of the original mask RCNN paper, they also proposed adding another classification head at the very end, which was a key point prediction head. So you could estimate human pose by like the 17, or I'm forgetting how many it was, but there's like a certain number of 2D key points on every person. You could train the network to also predict those. And so one of the nice takeaways from mask RCNN is, and it's kind of like this whole RCNN history, right? Is like, you're kind of every additional label that you can add during training is potentially adding like additional objectives to your optimization problem, which might help the networks improve across the tasks. So having multiple labels and then training with multiple losses added together is a pretty common approach in across deep learning. So the last thing I want to say, because I know we're out of time, is just that we've only been talking about two-stage detectors in this discussion. So RCNN, fast RCNN, faster RCNN, mask RCNN, they're all two-stage because they propose regions of interest and then they classify them. And this is in contrast to a different category of detectors, which are called single stage. So these are detectors like YOLO. Like there's an FCOS paper which proposed a loss function for single stage detectors. Where you would just have a purely convolutional network that doesn't try to like crop out features or crop out pixels and then run a separate network on top of those crops. It just is like the full detection as like a single forward pass of a CNN. We're not gonna have time to talk about those in this class, but we linked to some of them in the reading material. And because we're out of time, I'll stop there. Stick around for questions. Thanks for coming out, and I'm excited for next week.